As we're doing a rapid survey of the New Testament, there are some letters that I'm doing extremely rapidly, and I'm afraid two of those will be 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Some scholars believe that 1st Thessalonians is the second letter in the New Testament. I think it actually was the first letter that was authored in the New Testament. Whether you think it's the first or the second, it clearly was very early, probably somewhere around the year 48, or you can adjust it a few years, perhaps either way, but I'd say around the year 48. Thessalonica was very strategic for outreach. It was Macedonia's largest port, the capital of its old second district. It was now the residence of the provincial governor, and scholars have estimated as many as 200,000 residents lived there. So it was a very strategic place for Paul to plant a church. Unfortunately, he faced a lot of persecution there and was driven out of town. So the believers there in Jesus had been facing persecution just like Paul did. Paul himself has been slandered there. He can't be present to defend himself, although the charges in 1 Thessalonians 2 are really conventional responses to conventional critiques of radical teachers, radical sages. But Paul is sent to find out the spiritual welfare of his converts there, and he gets good news from Timothy that the Thessalonian believers remain firm in the faith. So Paul encourages them further. Now, the church is facing problems there, including persecution or ostracism. Possibly it was related to a local imperial cult, which was a very big deal in Thessalonica. But it could also be just in light of Paul's preaching of the imminence of God's kingdom. In Acts chapter 17, we see that he was misrepresented in his preaching about Jesus as king as preaching a rival to the emperor, which was, of course, illegal and could be punished with death. So there are some problems for the church in Corinth. The same people who made trouble for Paul are now making trouble for his friends. And apparently some are also afraid for those who've died in the meantime, not necessarily from persecution, but however they died, they're concerned about those because they're not alive for when the Lord comes back. Paul says, don't worry about it. When the Lord comes back, the dead in Christ will be the first to rise, and we'll meet them in the air. Or some think, well, the day of the Lord has already come. Paul talked about it coming soon. Paul says, don't worry. I mean, if somebody sent a letter as if from us, it's not from us. Remember, I told you certain things were going to happen. Yeah, the Lord is coming soon, but there's going to be some things that are going to happen first. Like before the day of the Lord comes, there's going to be a man of lawlessness on the throne and some other scary things. He didn't explain all of those, but he also says, some don't want to work, and maybe this is also because they're expecting the Lord to come very soon, although Thessalonica already had a fairly high unemployment rate. Paul goes on to remind them of teachings that he'd already taught them, and these teachings correspond very well to what we see of Jesus' teachings about the future in the Gospels. So in Matthew 24, Mark 13, some of Luke 21. One of these actually is in Acts chapter 1. But things that Jesus taught about the timing and the coming of the end. He warned about false prophets, apostasy, lawlessness, birth pangs. He also warned about something that is often taken to refer to the desecration of the temple by the Romans, at least as a foretaste of future suffering, and some others take it as the fulfillment. He also said, you don't know the times or the seasons of Israel's restoration in Acts chapter 1. He also taught about his coming, his parousia. That's in Matthew 24. Mark doesn't use that wording. Jesus coming on the clouds, his gathering together his chosen ones by his angels, his gathering them by the sound of a trumpet, his coming like a thief in the night. Well, Paul covers many of these same points, which I think means it's pretty clear that he's referring back to Jesus' teachings. Already in this first letter, or some think second letter, one of the earliest writings of the New Testament, written probably within 20 years after Jesus gave these teachings. Paul refers to these by saying he's giving them by the Lord's own word and the teachings that Paul had passed on to them, which was language that was often used for passing on what one received from an earlier teacher. Now, virtually all scholars today agree that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians. There's more debate on 2 Thessalonians, not because the style is so different. Actually, the style is so close that some say, this forger was imitating 1 Thessalonians, which I think is kind of an odd argument when the style is so close to Paul's. But they say, well, in one, he's talking about the Lord can come right away. And in the other, he's saying, well, there's a few things before it. Well, this isn't the only place where you have this, either in the Bible or in other ancient literature, where somebody's talking about something imminent, but they qualify it in certain ways. You have this often in Jewish apocalyptic literature. So I don't see any reason to think that it wasn't written by Paul, and I actually think there's good reason to think it wasn't written by somebody after Paul, certainly not much after Paul, because 2 Thessalonians describes a man of lawlessness setting up his seat in the temple. After 70, who's going to make a prediction like that? So, even if they think the temple will be rebuilt or whatever, this isn't the kind of prediction somebody would make after the temple lay in ruins. So the earliest letters in the New Testament, or among the earliest letters in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, attest that Jesus actually did talk about these things, and that memory was being preserved of these teachings a couple decades later, and certainly up till today, since we still have these letters. Now, I think it also means something else. And here I'm going to be very controversial. I think that Paul, using these sayings of Jesus, which were talking about his coming after a period of great tribulation, and his coming where it will be public and visible and so forth, and Paul applying this to when we are gathered to meet Jesus in the air, suggests that Paul is talking about Jesus coming at the very end, and not the idea that's been around for, in circulation, especially for, 180, 190 years, almost 200 years now. Especially it began circulating around 1830, the idea that the Christians would be raptured before the tribulation. I just don't see that in the biblical text. I actually think it points in a different direction. But that's something on which we can dialogue. What we can say for sure is that Paul wrote to suffering Christians who are in a difficult situation and encouraged them with hope in the coming of the Lord. That no matter what we suffer in this age, no matter what else we may have to go through, Jesus is coming back. That doesn't mean to quit your job, and it doesn't mean that we don't have any grief over those we've lost. But it does mean, as Paul says, that we don't grieve as those who have no hope. Jesus is coming. Always be ready.